ADELAR BERTUSSI.
The living legend of the Pampas, the drover of gaucho music.
Autor Valmir Zanellato.
Author's words. The story contained in this book, ADELAR BERTUSSI, was based in its entirety on more than 27 DVDs recorded and narrated by ADELAR BERTUSSI himself, to me Valmir Zanellato, the author of this work. Also gathered for this project were numerous CDs and an infinity of photographs, which are contained in my private collection, and which as a whole are from now on made available to all those who may take interest in their content. There were months and years of recordings, and the project began before the year 2000, thus counting approximately 20 years of research on the history of ADELAR BERTUSSI, of his life, of his parents, of the duo Hermanos Bertussi, in short, of the entire saga of his family. I thank ADELAR for the encouragement, trust, and opportunity to be able through this book to tell a little about his artistic journey and personal life, and to all his family members and friends, because without them, without their help and encouragement, I believe it would have been quite difficult for me to accomplish this work. I thank in particular my friend, writer and poet Elio Moreira, my partner, who has been with me since the beginning, rolled up his sleeves, and greatly helped in the work and responsibilities contained here for the realization of this work, and who with immeasurable kindness and dedication, never wanting any payment for his involvement. Eternal gratitude to my friend and partner of so many good days, the esteemed Elio Moreira. With a fraternal embrace, Valmir Zanellato.
The story of ADELAR BERTUSSI.
Below the story will be narrated as if it were by a second person. Presentation. This book aims to exalt the man ADELAR BERTUSSI and his triumphant trajectory through the annals of gaucho music. We begin rigorously with his ancestors, who in years gone by left everything behind and came to work in Brazil, more precisely in the region of Craiova, which at the time belonged to São Francisco de Paula and later became a district of Caxias do Sul. In this work is recorded the saga of his father and mother, who, still very young, accompanied ADELAR's grandfather, João Bertussi. They settled on the lands of Malata and built there an empire, striving arduously for the growth of the region, both economically and in terms of property. We recount from the Bertussi family the history and the feat of two brothers who promoted a true innovation in gaucho chants. With simplicity, they imposed their way of singing and playing. From those distant lands emerged the finest accordion players and singers of all time. The boys from Craiova were pioneers and became the phenomenal Hermanos Bertussi, being exalted and recognized by fellow gauchos and also on radio and television throughout Brazil. But the highlight of this book is the extraordinary ADELAR BERTUSSI, certainly the most complete accordionist ever seen around the world. Both as a soloist and in a supporting role, ADELAR is a man who turned into pure gold the lyrics he used to write his artistic trajectory. Being a genius with the accordion in his arms, he is internationally recognized by his own merits, something that earned him many honorable titles: the drover of gaucho music, the Rio Grande Smith, the living legend of the Pampas, and the gaucho heritage of Rio Grande do Sul. And he is still considered, due to the deeds that kindly elevated the entire south of the country, as the living legend of the gauchos and the only statue that walks and lives playing and singing through the southern lands. ADELAR BERTUSSI, in his life, totals more than 6,000 performances.
Biography of ADELAR BERTUSSI.
Musician, accordionist, singer, poet, and composer, ADELAR BERTUSSI is a native of Craiova, which in the past belonged, that is, was a district of the municipality of São Francisco de Paula, but which later came to belong to Caxias do Sul. He is the son of Fioravante Bertussi and Juvelina Medeiros de Siqueira. From a family of musicians, his father was conductor of the Craiova band from 1918 to 1928. He played all instruments, standing out on the clarinet and trumpet. In 1940, Fioravant formed a group with his 4 sons to play at parties and dances. The group was formed as follows: Honeyed, guitar and accordion; Valmir, clarinet and drums; Wilson, clarinet and saxophone; ADELAR, who as a boy played cavaquinho, handled the button accordion and the tambourine, later perfecting himself on the accordion. The group was a success and an attraction in the mountain region. In 1950, Honeyed and ADELAR stood out playing and singing when they formed the greatest gaucho duo of all time, the Hermeos Bertussi. ADELAR graduated from the Technical School of Commerce of Caxias do Sul, studied music with professors Waldomiro Torres do Valle 1948 to 1949, Eleonardo Caffi 1950 to 1954, at the Mascarenhas Academy, Rio de Janeiro, in 1959, and at the São Mar Music Conservatory, Curitiba, between 1995 and 1999, where he graduated in music theory, solfege and accordion, music history, and as an accordion teacher. ADELAR, between vinyl and CDs, immortalized himself using as leverage 7 commercial record labels: Copacabana, RCA Victor, Continental, Chanticleer, Caetel do Brasil, RG, and Acit. He performed more than 6,000 presentations, shows, and dances in the country and abroad. He has an immense number of recorded songs, including Southern folkloric and regional music, as well as Brazilian and international songs. Among his highlights are his fantasies for accordion, as works of great musical value: The Dreamer, Fantasy Number 01 in a major; The Dance of Sin in Baghdad and Musical Dawn, Fantasy in A-flat. Recorded in 1957 by Copacabana. He recorded Playing in the Snow and Strolling in the Snow, 1960 and 1962 respectively, by RCA Victor, and Ochi Chernia, Black Eyes, from Russian folklore, in a special arrangement for accordion by Continental in 1970. In 1985, he recorded with Copacabana the LP ADELAR Bertussi and his classical music, containing on side A6 Fantasies, The Wedding of Alsu, Walkway, Concentration, Idelza's 15th birthday, Itapiva, a tribute to the lagoon located in the municipality of Torres Ares and Patativa. On side B, The Continent of São Pedro, Concerto for accordion in 4 parts, opening, largo, minuet, and the grand finale. In the year of the sesquicentennial of the birth of Carlos Gomez, ADELAR recorded a video clip on RBS-TV Caxias do Sul, performing live the symphonic overture of the opera O Guarani, a tribute to the great master. He was a radio host and for years maintained musical programs on Radio Marinque Vega, RJ, 1955, Radio and TV Tupi, RJ, 1956, Fatima and Esmeralda of Vicaria, RS. 1966 to 1967, Difusora of Porto Alegre, 1970, Caxias, RS. 1976 to 1980, Princesa of Caxias do Sul, RS. 1982, and in Curitiba, Radio Club Paranense, PR. 1987 to 1988. As a historical traditionalist, ADELAR Bertussi holds meritorious diplomas from 26 centers of gaucho traditions: the Caxias do Sul Medal, 1973, Ernesto Marciani Medal, 1974, National Immigrant Monument Medal, 1975, Silver Jubilee Medal, granted by Rector Rui Paletti of the University of Caxias do Sul, 1997. He also received more than 30 trophies and silver plaques from public authorities, the press, and various entities. Among others, he also received the Diploma and Trophy ADELAR Bertussi, the Drover of Gaucho Music, RBSDV Santa Maria, RS, Diploma and Trophy from the Chamber of Caxias do Sul, Emeritus Citizen of Caxias do Sul Diploma, and the Honorable Leon de San Marco Diploma, as a highlight among descendants of Italian immigration in Brazil. A very relevant fact occurred on April 18, 1998. ADELAR Bertussi was celebrating 50 years of professional life and was the subject of great tributes throughout the south of the country. At the Bertussi farm, in São Jorge de Malata, Professor Natalino Boschetti promoted a grand celebration attended by guests from all communities of the district of Craiova, followed by showers of gifts and silver plaques from Gaucho entities. On that same day, the 18th, ADELAR was honored in Porto Alegre during the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the 35th Center of Gaucho Traditions, on which occasion he received the Pioneer Trophy. On June 25, 2013, in Porto Alegre, he received the Acorianos Trophy. The Gaiteros do Mundo Trophy had its ceremony held on November 17, 2014, at the Araujo Viana Events Center in Porto Alegre. Among high artistic and cultural expressions, on April 28, 1999, ADELAR Bertussi was honored with the Commendation Diploma, granted by the Municipal Chamber of Curitiba. Governor Jamie Lerner sanctioned Bill No. 6298, approved by the Legislative Assembly, which granted the title of Honorary Citizen of the State of Parana to the musician, singer, accordionist, poet, and composer ADELAR Bertussi, Law No. 122.219, published in the State Official Gazette on August 27, 1998. ADELAR Bertussi continues his intense professional activity, performing in shows, parties, and dances throughout the country, with the same excellent performance he has always had. He recalls the old, already consecrated themes and presents new ones. Valmir Zanellato begins to document ADELAR's accounts for his books during his trip and visit to his compadre and godfather, there at the Bertussi farm. Visit to the living legend and heritage of Rio Grande do Sul. Heading to the Bertussi farm. Valmir Zanellato prepares himself for yet another of his countless visits. He gathers his indispensable gear and, after checking that his traditional gaucho attire is impeccable, leaves Torres heading toward the Bertussi farm. With him, he takes his notebook, camera, recorder, and video camera, essential items when it comes to documenting the personal and artistic life of one of the greatest icons of Brazil and much of the world. Upon arriving at the farm, Zanellato can already be heard from afar shouting, "U de casa, U de casa." As usual, with that peculiar mountain hospitality, he is soon welcomed by ADELAR and his wife, Angela, as well as by their children and other family members, who once again receive him warmly and joyfully. They once more demonstrate the extraordinary and simple greatness of good customs, something typical of gauchos from the countryside. ADELAR, receptive and kind, soon takes up his accordion. While the chimarreo passes from hand to hand, between one conversation and another the host opens his old accordion and enchants everyone with his beautiful songs, now true established classics. Zanellato, missing nothing, continues documenting everything alongside ADELAR, capturing as well, imprinted in his retinas, all the countryside beauty of the admirable and well-kept Bertussi farm.
Built by Fioravante Bertussi, ADELAR's father.
The warm reception of ADELAR to his friend and compadre Valmir Zanellato. The cheese factory. Between conversations and walks, admiring and recording all the beauties of the farm, Zanellato had a pleasant surprise. Within the property, among the countless valuable objects, he discovered a cheese factory. Never before had he seen or visited such a place up close. Whenever he was at the farm, besides enjoying the cheese there, he would always end up taking some pieces of this tasty product with him, but he did not know that the cheeses were produced there. With great curiosity and already snooping around, he managed, patiently and in full detail, to have everything explained to him by ADELAR's eldest son, Gilmar Bertussi.
Visiting beautiful Craiova.
The village of Craiova witnessed the rise of the Hermeos Bertussi and, like a medicinal serum, is part of the blood that runs through the veins of this Rio Grandense heritage, ADELAR Bertussi. Whether due to the proximity of his residence, which is not far from Craiova, or through the musical references in some of the verses composed by ADELAR, it is clear that the emotional connection between them is very strong. As shown in one of his lyrics, where he proudly sings that on Sundays he would stroll through Craiova like a gallant. Inviting Zanelato and gathering their families, they headed to Craiova one day. They had the opportunity to visit it and photograph the central area in order to share some images with everyone. Already in the shed of the Bertussi farm in São Jorge de Malata. While ADELAR recounted details of his life, they went to the shed where every night the ranch hands would gather around the ground fire so that all could tell their tales and have a drink of cachaca, without, of course, setting aside the old meat drunk from the chimarrão gourd. Then ADELAR, who long ago had promised Zanelato to show him something unprecedented and important, led his friend to the wall that gave access to the shed on the right, presenting him with the sight of one of the most precious and rewarding relics that one could find in that place. Removing an old calendar that was pinned to the wall with thumbtacks, beneath it Zanelato could see a true treasure of monumental historical value. The text had been handwritten by Luis Gonzaga when, at the invitation of the Hermeos Bertussi, he had passed through the farm and honored them with a special and friendly visit. Luis Gonzaga, another giant of Brazilian music, a true hero for the northeastern people, had a friendship with these gaucho artists that began during the brothers' stay in Rio de Janeiro. ADELAR, mischievous, tells and smiles that when he played the accordion in an orchestral style, Luis Gonzaga would stand still watching him and would not tire of repeating in his accent and singing voice, "My God in heaven, no one plays better than this boy." What a beautiful thing! At the Malata farm, Luis Gonzaga, taking a carpenter's pencil that was there, wrote on the wall of the shed a dedication to the two brothers, which still today, very visible and strong, stands out. It is a thank you for the hospitality he received from ADELAR and Honeyed, leaving the following message. On September 23, 64, in this shed, sang the King of Baião and King of Friendliness of Brazil, Luis Gonzaga. To the Bertussis, my gratitude. Luis Gonzaga, Veo Macho. In Valmir Zanellato's book about the life of ADELAR Bertussi, more than 100 photos record his trajectory. Seated in the main room of the farmhouse, ADELAR autographs his CDs and hands over the complete collection with all the works produced throughout the Bertussi family's career. As a gift, he passes everything into the hands of Valmir Zanellato. Meanwhile, ADELAR nostalgically recounts how his meeting with Davi Nasser had been, then the leading journalist in Rio de Janeiro and the largest shareholder of the magazine O Cruzeiro. As a bonus, he talks about the recording of his first vinyl record by the Copacabana label. While signing each CD one by one, ADELAR recalls, enthusiastically, each song that had been composed for the next 4 vinyl records, under contractual clause. He even sings a little piece of each one that was recorded on the second LP. ADELAR also recalls that all the songs, without exception, were tremendous successes. Among them all, however, special mention must be made of the Zote Laranjeira, which was a pearl they gathered from Gaucho mountain folklore and one of the songs still most performed today. Noting that it first became a hit in Curitiba and that
March
all
31st,
radio programs used it as a jingle. Construction began on the monument to the Hermeos Bertussi. ADELAR helped oversee the construction, providing water, electricity, and everything necessary for the success of the project. Most of the time, Zanellato was in ADELAR's company, and from the beginning they followed the start of the works of the Bertussi Memorial. The obelisk stands over 33 meters high, and the statues of the two brothers are over 3.5 meters tall. The memorial can be seen from a long distance, well before approaching the farm, sharing chimarrão and listening to stories and songs. Upon returning to the interior of the farmhouse, ADELAR prepared the chimarrão, and they settled comfortably in the large living room of the farm. Running his hand over the accordion, ADELAR called his son ADELARzinho, Zanellato's godson, who, despite his young age, is already highly skilled on the drums. The boy then began accompanying him in the rhythm of the accordion. Afterward, ADELARzinho gave a performance on the keyboard, leaving everyone amazed. Though still very young, with music in his blood, he already masters the keyboard almost perfectly. Then, for the delight of the visitors, ADELAR began to play and sing his most requested songs, those that throughout this vast Brazil made and still make tremendous success, such as Baile na Serra and the Zotes Laranjeira, Laura Cassada, U de Casa, Bugio Assenhado, and many other songs. Stopping his playing, ADELAR returned to sipping the chimarrão with pleasure, called his friends to come closer, and asked them to sit around him so they could better listen to the stories he would begin to tell. He began recounting events that happened even before his birth and, as if narrating a spectacular film, spoke of his late father and his feats in the region of Craiova, more precisely some stories that took place in the lands of São Jorge da Malata. He also told how his journey toward excellence in his artistic life began, describing the exciting circumstances of how the first contact for the trip to Rio de Janeiro occurred, as well as about the Bertussi brothers' stay and experiences at the musical academy of Mario Mascarenhas, what they absorbed there and made great use of in their performances on the major radio stations of Rio de Janeiro. Such stories will, in due time, in this book, be properly told. ADELAR recounts that his great-grandmother, Ana Nunes Martins, was an indigenous woman from Vicaria, from the Batacudos tribe, known for being very fierce and dangerous. His great-grandfather, Antonio José Siqueira, was a bugler from the Paranaguases tribe, Paranaguapiar, having fought in the Paraguayan War and serving as an ensign in the police of Bahia. However, Antonio was more than an ordinary soldier, as he held a higher rank and was an excellent swordsman, a practitioner of capoeira, and knowledgeable in boxing. He was a member of the Gaucha military brigade, remaining in it until his retirement. He chose to stay in Rio Grande do Sul and settled in the region of Craiova, where he married, started a family, and raised many children. According to records, they were raised under a regime like soldiers prepared for war, as if at any moment they might be called to fight. ADELAR's mother, Juvelina, precisely because she had been raised under this regime of preparation for war, under the strictness of her parents, although that strictness contained the purest and most sincere truths of life, passed the same on to her children, ADELAR and his 3 brothers. She would say to them with her finger pointed, addressing each one face to face, a man must have self-respect, must have respect for others, honor his word, never commit injustice, and maintain good relations with neighboring ranchers. By acting this way, you will have a standard for a life filled with harmony. By following what I tell you faithfully, you will have no regrets and will always be at peace with your conscience and with the divine laws left to us by Christ Jesus. By following his mother's advice, ADELAR never had reason for regret, becoming the honorable and proud man he always was, who throughout the Gaucho lands and beyond elevated his name and that of our beloved Rio Grande do Sul. About his marriage and family. Later, marrying and following the natural course of life, ADELAR raised his own children, never forgetting his mother's teachings and passing them on to his offspring. And they, by following the wisdom and footsteps of their father, also gave continuity to this family history, to ADELAR's pride, becoming upright people who continue to elevate the inherited name and keeping within themselves the old maxim, respect in order to be respected. Thus, they continue to further elevate this noble state, being recognized throughout the beloved Brazil. About the life of ADELAR's mother. ADELAR Bertussi's mother, Giuvelina, was born on November 10, 1903, belonging to the Siqueira family. Her grandmother was from the Alves family, from Gravataí and Madeiras, from Porto Alegre. Giuvelina was born with a military instinct and a sharp strategic sense. When the Revolution of 1923 broke out, Assis Brazil against Borges de Madeiras, and Fioravante declared himself a Marigato, he became marked by the Chamengos, who could not tolerate the affront imposed by the brave young man. Openly, in front of everyone, ADELAR's father declared that he felt outraged by the injustices being committed by them. One day an escort was sent from Craiova toward Fioravante's house, when Giuvelina was only 21 years old and pregnant with her first child. As soon as the escort arrived at the house, which at that time was located near the Malata River, formerly belonging to Antonio Feliciano dos Passos, near where the waterfall of the power plant is today, the leader found himself in a difficult situation. He wanted to recruit ranch hands to reinforce his troops, but saw that only Giuvelina stood at the window. Already aware of her husband's intolerance toward injustice, she had previously asked him to let her handle the conversation with the Chamengos and, if necessary, she would call him. Fioravante, somewhat reluctantly, remained on alert. Then the Chamengo leader stepped forward and, noticing Giuvelina calm, confident, upright, and self-assured, looking him straight in the eyes, decided to change tactics. Respectfully greeting her, he explained that he was there because he needed a good ranch hand to reinforce his troops, having heard that the best and bravest were on her farm. She, well educated by her parents, quickly thought, to step back does not mean to lose a battle. And so, calm and composed, emphasizing her words and speaking clearly, slowly, and with authority, she agreed with the leader, saying she would send the best ranch hand as soon as possible. The Chamengos, surprised by the affirmative response, since they expected resistance that would justify attacking the house, were left speechless and without action. Shortly after, the spokesman, having nothing more to do, politely thanked her and ordered his men to rein in their horses, withdrawing peacefully back to Craiova. 2 months later, Huneed was born, at the height of the 1923 revolution, which lasted until 1925 or early 1926. Huneed, in adolescence, later became a violent and dangerous caudillo against the Chamengos. Contextualizing. Before continuing the facts, we need to clarify some rules that were pre-established at the time of the arrival of Italian settlers in Brazil. Still during the imperial era, in 1875, Dom Pedro II, wishing to populate part of Brazil, which was a vast expanse of uninhabited land without labor for agricultural work, intending to strengthen Brazilian agriculture or simply to build colonies where other resources could be explored, such as livestock and mineral extraction, made contact with other countries to send all kinds of people to Brazil, especially settlers willing to establish themselves in the southern region, there were fertile lands that would provide rapid enrichment for those who were strong and willing to work. The Italian government agreed to send part of its people, who were settlers determined to carry out partial colonization. Thus, in 1877 and 1878, they populated the promised land and watered the soil with their sweat so that both Brazil and they themselves could prosper. However, the Italians wanted guarantees, and the emperor's word assured that immigration would proceed as agreed, giving them peace of mind to better perform their work. The Italian government made a stipulation to Dom Pedro II and to the treaty in progress, requiring that, under no circumstances, would Italian settlers be involved in wars and revolutions, which at that time were very common. They should not be disturbed in any way in their right to work, having full freedom of movement and expression. As Dom Pedro II was determined to initiate colonization, He promptly accepted all the demands of the Italian government, committing his word ethically and morally. In those times, a man's word was something honored and fulfilled, holding the same value as any signed document. Documents could be lost, but a word given face-to-face would never be lost. Therefore, German immigration, 1824, and Italian immigration, 1877, were protected by an ethical treaty under which these European citizens could not be involved in wars or revolutions. Both President Julio de Castillos and his successor Borges de Medeiros always devoted deep respect and political and administrative support to European immigrants. Thus, by decree, it was established that under no circumstances, regardless of conflicts in Brazil, Italian and German settlers would be involved or punished. Pioneers and future generations would remain exempt from penalties as long as they continued on their lands and in their work. It should also be clarified that a law decreed by the emperor was very strict and truly enforced, and those who disobeyed were relentlessly pursued, paying for it with their own lives. Therefore, the settlers came with all possible guarantees and were indeed protected, both by the Brazilian Empire and, even more rigorously, by provincial presidents. Among them, the most notable was Julio de Castillos of the Republican Party, who reinforced these guarantees with greater strictness, maintaining them for his successor Borges de Medeiros. Fioravante fit into these privileges when he confronted the Pica-Paus. The commanders were large landowners, distinguished by wearing green scarves. Very wealthy, they committed barbarities in the name of the government. And, it must be said, these were acts that the government either did not know about or chose not to know. On the day Fioravante Bertussi declares himself a Marigato. Fioravante Bertussi, who was protected by imperial and presidential laws, after witnessing for a long time the injustices inflicted upon the Marigatos and the poor people, one day, outraged and resolute, went to Craiova, where at that time the center and headquarters of the Chimengos were located. He went to demand explanations and declared that he was a Marigato, letting it be seen, allowing its ends to fly in the wind, the red scarf he wore around his neck. Fioravante did not tolerate cruelty, nor could he approve of the barbarities committed against defenseless people, such as killing without reason, looting homes, and raping mothers and young maidens. And the worst was that, after taking advantage and committing all kinds of carnal and moral abuses, they would still slit the victims' throats. As expected, the Chimengos, upon hearing the words of reproach directed at them, rose up, felt offended, and only did not kill him on the spot because they were astonished by such boldness. Nevertheless, such an affront they could not accept and began shouting and intimidating Fioravante, demanding that he remove the scarf from his neck and throw it to the ground. Amid angry and insolent cries, the Chimengos ordered, "Take off that scarf, shameless foreigner." At the same time, they made gestures as if they were going to draw their weapons to settle the matter quickly. Unshaken, however, Fioravante also made a move as if to draw his .38 revolver loaded with bullets from his waist. Certainly, he would shoot before them, perhaps not killing them all. In any case, since the young man was an excellent marksman, with 8 bullets there would be 8 dead. And since none of the Chimengos was willing to die, they only wanted to display a power they did not truly possess, at least those present there. They remained shouting, waiting for the immigrant to be frightened and comply with what had been ordered. The story of the death of the scarf. The Chimengos, enraged, continued to press. Seeing that Fioravante would not obey them, they became increasingly exasperated and on edge. They were already willing to shoot the insolent man, whether he was protected or not. What they wanted was to silence and end the arrogance of that young man, full of courage and open-chested, standing there alone, face to face, confronting them. His mother, who heard the shouts demanding that he remove the scarf from his neck and throw it to the ground, being herself also an immigrant, with her head held high, walked past the indignant Chimangos and went to her son, removing the scarf from his neck and handing it to those offended and thirsty for revenge. Since they could do nothing against an Italian protected by law, the Chimangos, in a fit of anger and in a completely unexpected act, tore the scarf into 1,000 pieces, throwing it disdainfully to the ground. Then they fired more than 40 shots at the cloth, venting their vengeance upon the defenseless and innocent scarf. The group of Chimangos, now all satisfied for having performed such an act of bravery, finally withdrew. They disappeared, galloping arrogantly on the backs of their frightened horses. Here ADELAR teaches Zanellato how to prepare the anthill mouth chimarrão. Between one narrative and another, ADELAR Bertussi, taking a pause, picked up his gourd. At Zanellato's request, he began step by step to explain the requirements for preparing chimarrão in the boca de formigueiro style. For this, ADELAR began. The gourd must be suitable. It needs to have a wide mouth, a narrow neck, and a slightly bulging lower part. The boca de formigueiro chimarrão, ADELAR explained, consists of filling the gourd with cold water up to the level of the neck, ensuring that the flat, perforated part of the metal straw, which must already be fixed inside the gourd before the yerba, is fully submerged. Only afterwards should the remaining space above the water and neck be filled with yerba mate. It should be left to rest for a few minutes and, with the tip of a knife, a teaspoon, or any other object, a small hole should be opened on the opposite side from where the straw is located. Little by little, a small amount of water is poured each time the hole is deepened, until it reaches the cold water at the bottom of the gourd, where the perforated part of the straw is. Then, through this opening, the gourd should be filled with hot water. Afterward, without moving the straw, the water inside the gourd should be sipped as many times as necessary, discarding it. Only after the water reaches the proper point should the chimarrão be consumed and passed along. In the boca de formigueiro style, the water is easily drawn and it is not necessary to strain the tongue to sip it. It should be noted that ADELAR has the habit of tying the straw to the gourd with a piece of wire, claiming it to be a preventive practice against careless chimarrão drinkers. Such careless people move and collapse all the yerba, ruining the chimarrão and the beauty of the drink, soaking the mate with the collapse that occurs. Finally, ADELAR also tells Zanellato that only one of the drinkers should serve everyone in the chimarrão circle, these being called the mate servers. He also explains that at the end it is always advisable to remove the yerba and wash the gourd. Otherwise, within 1 or 2 hours, the chlorine used to treat the water ends up darkening the yerba and may even damage the gourd. History of the Craiova Band. Julio de Castillos, who was one of the most important presidents of the province of Rio Grande do Sul, had refined taste and was an excellent gatherer of votes. At the time he was president, the Italian community already voted, and there was a considerable number of votes in the colonies to his satisfaction. Borges de Medeiros, upon succeeding him, followed closely in his footsteps. In this presidential sequence, the Italians held a certain advantage because they sought to culturally elevate all the colonies under their influence. However, naturally, the main presidential objective was the conquest of votes. One day, in Craiova, from afar the creaking of a wagon was heard. It is worth noting that at that time there were not many noises to interfere with the hearing of the ranchmen, but ox carts, with their heavy wooden wheels, produced a creaking sound that could be heard from as far as 5 kilometers away. When they knew the reason and which cart was making the noise, they would not worry, but when it was unexpected, curiosity stirred them, and they all rushed to see. This unusual cart came loaded with 24 musical instruments, almost all wind instruments. These instruments had been sent from São Leopoldo and were intended to form a band in Craiova. Moreover, They were accompanied by the renowned maestro Oswaldo Cornelius, an educated man knowledgeable in music, who would teach the people how to use the instruments. In Craiova, ADELAR's grandfather, João Bertussi, owned a blacksmith shop, and his son Fioravante helped him there, at the time only 13 years old. Fioravante was among the first to reach the cart, and the maestro, seeing that enthusiastic young boy running, called him to ask if he knew of a place where he could stay for a while. Fioravante, a clever and resourceful boy, already knew how to produce chords from a small accordion his father had given him. Upon seeing that pile of instruments meant to be played, or rather blown, he ran back to the blacksmith shop and brought his father, almost dragging him, to be introduced to the maestro and to see the instruments. Right there, leaning against the cart wheels, they reached an agreement. Thus, the maestro went to live in João Bertussi's house, leaving young Fioravante bursting with joy. The instruments, by agreement with the church priest, were stored there. The priest was also pleased, as the band would surely elevate Craiova's name. Fioravante, no longer thinking about his small accordion, spent his days trying each instrument, attempting to find the one that best suited him. He blew into all of them, but produced only strange sounds. Time passed, and he achieved nothing remarkable. He was already somewhat tired of trying them all, and this first contact even diminished his interest in some instruments. Then, as if by magic, a clarinet came into his hands. When he held that small and delicate instrument, full of holes and keys, he liked it immediately. On the first attempt, he even managed to produce something like a note. Very enthusiastic, Fioravante learned quickly and soon became the best clarinet player in the region. As time went by, the maestro finally managed to tune those men, hardened by rural labor, into melody. He formed a spectacular band that soon would perform in distant places. Afterward, satisfied and tired, Maestro Oswaldo Cornelius, after 3 years of hard work from 1915 to 1918, decided to return to São Leopoldo. However, he left as maestro his best musician, already a master, who enchanted everyone with his clarinet. Fioravante remained as conductor for 10 years, until 1928. He learned to skillfully play all the band's instruments and, until his departure, continued playing his clarinet, always excelling in that art. Fioravante only left his position as band conductor in 1928, when a retired military man named Marcílio Godoy appeared in Craiova. Wanting very much to work, Fioravante handed over his position to him. The military man had knowledge of bands and truly knew how to play. After verifying his abilities, Fioravante passed the conductor's role to him and handed over all the instruments. Afterward, he returned to his duties on the farm. Unfortunately, however, the military man was already quite elderly and soon passed away. The band disbanded, and the instruments, with the priest's consent, were returned to the church, where they remained stored for a long time. Life went on in Malata, and Fioravante attended to his affairs without major concerns. His 4 sons grew up normally, each in his work. None of them had any more interest in the instruments stored in the church, nor did Fioravante think of reforming the band. One afternoon in 1938, when everything seemed to be just another ordinary day, a breathless ranch hand came to Fioravante. He said that a cart was coming quickly toward him from Craiova. It should be noted that such carts were usually pulled by oxen and moved slowly, but this one had been adapted for mules and moved faster along the dirt roads, raising clouds of dust. From afar, Fioravante recognized the driver. It was Albino Policar. What could have happened for him to come so quickly? Then, with the cart stopped in front of the main house, the mules still panting, Albino approached Fioravante and announced in a serious voice, "The priest sent me to deliver these instruments to you. He no longer wants them in the church, because the youngsters invade the place and keep blowing into them, making a terrible noise and disturbing the mass." He asks that you find the owners and return them to whom they belong. Now, so much time had passed that those instruments had been in Craiova that such an order seemed senseless. Besides, Fioravante only knew they had been sent by Borges de Medeiros and that the cart had come from São Leopoldo with the first maestro. But who the owners were, he had no idea, nor would he concern himself with seeking them. Thus, he received the instruments and placed them in the large room of his house. In 1928, Fioravante moved with his family to Vicaria and formed a small musical group, performing the scores that accompanied the first silent films. However, although he lived in Vicaria, he still maintained business in Craiova as a cattleman and sawmill partner. In 1932, Fioravante Bertussi returned to Craiova and built the headquarters of the Bertussi farm in São Jorge de Malata. A very funny episode. Here follows a funny episode from the history of the Bertussi family, at least for the boys. ADELAR Bertussi, at a young age, would at times become quite a restless boy. He and his brothers, no less lively, led a normal life in the countryside, partly working in the Malata fields. With the arrival of the band instruments, which had been placed in the large room of the house, the mother's despair began. From then on, the boys would spend much of the day blowing into those noisy things, to the point that their lips would sometimes turn purple. Altogether, they made a racket enough to drive anyone mad, and this nearly drove Dona Juvelina crazy. Desperate and no longer able to bear so many wild, discordant and shrill sounds, she would run after them with a broom or a slipper in hand, chasing away the blowing boys and forcing them back to work with the hoe. This kind of childish mischief, however, is almost impossible to control, especially when the objects attracting their attention were familiar things, with music ingrained in each of them as inheritance. Musicality was something they ardently desired, and they thought only of returning to the room to restart their childish symphony, a session of torture for Juvelina. Running in fear of their mother's broom, the boys would return to the fields. But one of them would stay on lookout and wait until their mother went back to her chores, and when they felt she was distracted, quietly they would return and begin blowing again. Soon after, there came the poor mother again, running with the broom, chasing them off once more. This went on for quite some time, until Signor Fioravante, sensing a spark, made a serious decision. He would make sure the boys stopped treating that handling of instruments merely as play. He would make them dedicate themselves seriously and diligently to learning each instrument. As everyone already knew, Fioravante had music in his blood. Since he loved it dearly, from then on he did everything possible so that his sons would study and become good musicians. Honeyed, despite being the eldest son and already a good accordion player, since he had learned much from his father, still needed more experience in musical terms. Since more learning was needed, in the years 1944 and 1945, Signor Fioravante made him travel. He would leave Malata and ride on horseback, with his accordion on his saddle, going to study with a teacher in Caxias do Sul, Signor Victor Lazar. The father, very intelligently, knew how to play all the band's instruments and from the beginning sensed the boys' interest in the art. Therefore, he decided to teach them as best he could. At least they would stop making all that noise that drove their mother crazy, while also saving themselves from the dreaded broom beatings. Fioravante, after guiding them extensively, left them at ease for some time. One fine day, he gathered the four of them and asked them to show what they had already learned. And, just imagine surprise. Suddenly he saw and heard them playing and smiled proudly. They were amazing, real masters, playing everything well in tune. He liked it so much that he decided to form a family band. The band's first performance took place in 1942 during a religious celebration in honor of St. George. The event occurred in the chapel of Malata itself, which had been built by his father, João Bertussi. It was a tremendous success. As everyone liked the band's harmony, The boys never stopped performing. Little by little, throughout the region, everyone wanted Fioravant's band, whose name was Dois Perungos Acoirados. This name referred to 2 or more gourds tied together, used as flotation devices for ranch hands who could not swim. During flood times, these men had to cross from one bank to the other of the wild river, terrified, relying purely on strength. The band's name arose as a joke from teasing by one of the brothers, Wilson. He stood up playing the saxophone and wrote it on his brother Valmir's bass drum, which was used as a pace marker in religious processions in the region. The purchase of the first accordion. Honeyed Bertussi buys his first accordion. Honeyed Bertussi stood out and made a name for himself throughout Rio Grande do Sul as an accordion player, being equally applauded and acclaimed across Brazil. He would play his music for entire nights with only his accordion, being acclaimed by all as an excellent singer. Let us narrate Honeyed's story, told personally by ADELAR to Zanellato. Honeyed had played accordion since childhood and, although he was already known and famous, he did not own an instrument worthy of his level. In 1941, he gathered his pride and finally managed to buy his first accordion. From then on, he would play and sing with even greater enthusiasm, being highly sought after by dance hall owners to brighten great fandangos and festivities. Saturdays were the most anticipated days, and the dances lasted until dawn, or until the sun rose, as his admirers would say. In 1941, there was no standard fee for hiring a musician, but Honeyed, being clever, already had a sense of the value of his work, something that will be explained later. Playing at dances as he did was no small task, as it left the accordion player exhausted and often involved in fights. At that time, since there was no security, everything was resolved by family members and the owner of the dance hall. There was no restriction on carrying weapons, and when gauchos prepared to go dancing, they carried knives and revolvers at their waists. It was common in many dances, late at night, for tempers to flare, resulting in fights. Until the fights were broken up, the poor accordion player might receive a few blows. Sometimes, an even more agitated drunk would appear, complaining that the musician was playing unwillingly, using this trivial excuse to try to split the accordion in half with a machete. Honeyed, being strong and brave, was not known to avoid trouble. If the fight involved 2 or 3 opponents, he did not back down, and would even feel offended when some unsuspecting man tried to challenge him. One strike and the fellow would be gone. However, Honeyed was aware of his true artistic value and began charging the equivalent of a fat ox per dance, which at that time was not a small amount. In no time, he had turned his earnings into a fine herd of cattle. At this point in the story, ADELAR pauses, tells it, and laughs. And I confess that when I learned how everything had happened, I also laughed heartily. Even so, I found it hard to believe that things had occurred exactly like that. But since Valmir Zanellato, being ADELAR's friend and partner for more than 30 years, confirmed it, and then ADELAR himself reaffirmed it personally, I had to believe it. Honeyed already had enormous fame, his name spreading across Rio Grande as the best dance musician. But like all mortals, one day he fell ill with pleurisy, fluid in the lungs. The illness came from poorly treated pneumonia and, by medical order, he had to remain bedridden and under treatment for a long time. ADELAR still did not have his own accordion, but he was already taking his first steps as a musician. He was learning with a teacher in Caxias do Sul and already knew how to play a dozen songs. He learned easily, and these songs were a source of pride for him and those who heard them. It is worth noting that ADELAR soon became a great accordion player, praised by many, even considered the best of the time. So the story continues. ADELAR would carry a note from his brother to the dance hall owner explaining that, due to illness, he could not attend. However, his younger brother ADELAR was there to honor the commitment. The fact is that after each dance, upon returning home, ADELAR handed over all the money earned to Hanid. Since his brother was the one contracted and was bedridden and unable to earn his own income, ADELAR gave him everything, never accepting a single coin for his work. Eventually, Hanid recovered and was cleared by the doctor to return to playing. At that time, what he heard most were praises for his brother. Clearly, ADELAR BERTUSSI was becoming very capable. Calling ADELAR, Hanid said, "From today on, you will play at the dances with me. We will be partners with our 2 accordions." Hanid taught him how to accompany him, and thus was born the new duo of accordion players, something unprecedented as no one had ever attempted it. ADELAR played duets with Hanid and quickly stood out. His fame spread nationwide as the best second accordion player in the country. The beauty of their performances amazed people, who often stopped dancing just to stand close and listen to the duo throughout the night. The beginning on the radio. Hanid had been performing for some time on a traditionalist program on Radio Caxias do Sul. After some time, Hanid and ADELAR were already playing at dances and singing. Their music increasingly resonated with all Rio Grandenses, enchanting both city and countryside audiences. They were requested across Rio Grande do Sul and much of Santa Catarina. One day, there they were, at the scheduled time, to play on the radio. The program ran from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. The host opened the program and simply handed it over to the brothers to play whatever they wished. They played endlessly, one song after another. Listeners responded enthusiastically, delighting in their music. Until then, no one had ever heard of 2 accordions played simultaneously. The success was so great that when they finished, a crowd had gathered outside the station to see them. It should be noted that Hanid and ADELAR received the highest honors that 2 accordion-playing singers could receive at that time. At one point, a survey commissioned by the state electric company sought to determine the best musicians and singers in Rio Grande do Sul, and it quickly became known that the Irmãos BERTUSSI were the favorites. The survey covered the entire state, especially the highland regions, where the result in favor of the brothers was overwhelming. Everyone knew and spread far and wide that the BERTUSSI had become the best accordion players, first by divine will, and then by their mastery in performing regional folklore. To complete their image, they always dressed well wherever they went. A strong will made them succeed through competence. The Irmãos BERTUSSI duo accumulated hundreds of trophies throughout their successful artistic career and received countless honorary diplomas from authorities across Brazil. A note about the singer ADELAR BERTUSSI. ADELAR always confided to Zanelato that he was not exactly a singer, but a chanter. His voice, although it brought him to the highest musical levels, had many flaws. Even so, ADELAR BERTUSSI became a musical myth throughout Brazil. Those who followed his career may wonder, what if he had truly been a great singer? How far would he have gone? Still as a child, from 1958, at 7 years old, from the first time I heard them, I liked them and began to follow the trajectoria of the Irmãos BERTUSSI. I never stopped appreciating them. Even today, at home, they are the most listened to. But here I am writing their story and wondering, please explain to me, how can a man become a myth singing and playing, now a living legend and heritage of Rio Grande do Sul, if his voice was not equal to his talent? Answer me, dear thoughts. And what if he had been gifted with a magnificent voice? ADELAR continues explaining that it was not he who completed the accordion, but the opposite. It was the accordion that completed him. By divine inspiration, he learned to control the bass notes and create a kind of musical duet with them. Using the instrument's properties, whenever he felt his voice might fail, ADELAR would rely on this resource, allowing the sound of the accordion to cover his flaws while he continued singing boldly and without defect. In one of his songs, Making clear the support of the accordion in covering the flaws of his vocal cords, ADELAR Bertussi confesses, "My voice is not good, but my verses are well made, and with this friendly accordion of mine, ADELAR has no flaws." Father Emilio's invitation to the two brothers. One day, the brothers were at the Mulatto farm, where they liked to stay and rest between performances. Suddenly, a shout was heard calling them, and in the distance a horseman was approaching in great haste. He dismounted and, in a friendly manner, embraced the brothers, immediately saying he was their relative, which was later confirmed. After the introductions, the writer began to explain the reason for the long journey that had brought him to Mulatto. He had been sent by Father Emilio, from the town of Pureemotion, in Santa Catarina, to hire them for a grand celebration the priest was planning. The parish priest, cunning as he was, wanted to build a new church and needed to raise funds for its construction. For that, he needed someone famous to perform and attract as large a crowd as possible, which would increase the amount of money collected. But in any case, let that be. The fact was that the priest already knew the Bertussi name and knew they were a phenomenon, and that everyone would rush to acclaim them. They were the best, and the clever priest believed that only the duo could draw the desired audience, since people would always stop their work and gather just to receive them. In the end, everything was agreed upon between the parties, including the price of the show and the brothers' accommodation. On the appointed day, the brothers presented themselves to the priest, and the celebration was colossal. There was a record-breaking crowd, and this left the church coffers with enough money to build not just one, but two churches. The priest could even purchase all the images and furnishings needed to decorate the temple, where he could more properly receive and care for his Christian flock. At the celebration, people from all surrounding areas gathered in Pureemotion. Radio hosts and dance hall owners, seeing the true strength and phenomenon that the Bertussi brothers represented, lined up to hire them. Many even promised to pay more than what the brothers were already charging. The success was so great on the radio, at dances, in various clubs, and even in private performances for ranchers and prominent businessmen that the brothers were only able to return to Mulatto 3 months later. And they only did so because they had an important commitment with Radio Cacique in Lagoa Vermelha. The journey through Pureemotion was a total success for both the Bertussi brothers and Father Emilio. The media of the time regarding the Bertussi brothers. The written, spoken, and televised media, regardless of time or place, has extraordinary power, especially when considering certain characteristics of that era. At the beginning of the Bertussi brothers' trajectory, newspapers were not widely distributed, and radio, even technically limited, was almost sovereign in transmitting information. Through radio broadcasts, especially local ones, everyone eagerly awaited what would be announced. The Bertussi brothers were returning from Santa Catarina and stopped in Arequim, where they intended to greet the radio host Alvaro Aquino. He, already aware of their triumphant journey, took them straight to the radio station, and it caused quite a stir. Alvaro shouted at the top of his lungs that the accordion players were returning from a great tour through the state of Santa Catarina and were heading to Lagoa Vermelha, where they would perform on Radio Cacique. He promoted them so intensely that the people of Arequim, all glued to their radios, ran to the station to acclaim the brothers. Later, when they arrived in Lagoa Vermelha, it was even more impressive. A crowd was already waiting for them, including the owner of the station, the bank manager, and other prominent figures of the town. Even the most distant shopkeeper closed his business, leaving customers behind, just to celebrate the arrival of the musicians.
The speaker ADELAR Bertussi. On August 13, 2008, em Torres, ADELAR gave a lecture at Sítio da Figueira.
The title of the lecture was The Soul as an Example of Life, and the musicians spoke about the coordination between body, mind, soul, and spirit. ADELAR Bertussi, since childhood, He recalls being about 4 years old, began to understand what God represented in his life. From that moment on, he came to respect him above all else and always sought to please him. ADELAR was enchanted by the perfection of earthly things and often said that the administration up above was admirable, especially the specialized department that governed the earth. On festive dates, Christmas, Easter, and other celebrations, ADELAR was always invited by radio stations and religious organizers to perform. Once a young man and now over 70 years old, he is still asked, at the end of his performances, to leave a message for his Christian brothers. ADELAR never hesitates and immediately delivers his message that everyone should be happy and always strive to please God, being humble and honest. Simply be honest with yourselves. A lesson of morality and faith. Even today, our character sings and plays 2 unforgettable songs, forever etched in people's hearts. One day, in the town of Bom Jesus, at an event called Accord dos Músicos, where each accordion player performed 2 songs, after nearly all had already showcased their best, including honeyed Bertussi, it was ADELAR's turn. The presenter called him up, and after the usual formalities, he began to play. With unmatched elegance, he opened and closed the accordion masterfully. The result: total applause and acclaim from both fellow musicians and the audience, further elevating his reputation. After the show, as is customary in the gaucho tradition, there was a large barbecue for the participants. ADELAR, a thoughtful man, remained quietly seated on a bench, waiting to be served. Then a colleague from Porto Alegre approached him, clearly bothered by the continued success of those 2 songs ADELAR performed. In such moments, that small seed of envy that some people carry within them emerges, the jealousy among peers. ADELAR could not keep playing the same songs, otherwise nothing would be left for the other man. Yet, every time those songs were played, they received overwhelming acclaim. It should be noted that ADELAR, out of professional ethics, refrained from mentioning the colleague's name. But it is known that the man sat beside him, placed a hand on his knee, and said, "ADELAR, don't you think it's time to change those 2 songs? People are getting tired of them." See how the plot of a jealous colleague unfolds. If ADELAR stopped playing them, the envious one would have a better chance to succeed. Looking directly into the man's eyes, ADELAR reflected on the matter. Then, as he tells it, he felt an intuition, his guardian angel, as an intermediary of God, gave him the answer. Speaking calmly, ADELAR replied, "Well, I've thought about that, but my guardian angel tells me to continue, because God gave these 2 songs to me, and with them I continue to receive applause and be the most acclaimed. If that weren't the case, God would have given them to you, and you would be the one being praised. But he gave them to me, and that's why I will keep playing them." The man deflated instantly, gave a forced smile, and walked away, leaving ADELAR sitting there calmly, waiting for his barbecue. It must be said that these songs were composed more than 50 years ago, and even today, in all of ADELAR's performances across Brazil, they remain the most requested. As he himself confides, "After I play Baile na Serra and Bugio Assanhado, I can close the accordion and go home." Christmas of 2008 and the trip to Rio de Janeiro. Valmir Zanellato spent Christmas of 2008 with the BERTUSSI family at his ranch in Curitiba. He heard directly from ADELAR the story of their journey to Rio de Janeiro and how their successful trajectory in the marvelous city began. Honeyed repaired accordions, and one day he fixed one for a Portuguese woman who lived in Rio de Janeiro. She was the wife of Milton de Villa, artistic director of the Magazine O Cruzeiro, and, for some reason, she was passing through Caxias do Sul. It was agreed that Honeyed would personally deliver the repaired instrument to her home in Rio. Days later, the 2 brothers traveled to Rio de Janeiro. Upon arriving, Honeyed asked permission to demonstrate the instrument so the woman could hear the quality of his work. The accordion sounded as good as new. Taking advantage of the long trip, they had already planned to visit certain places in the city after the delivery. Honeyed played a sequence of songs that left the woman amazed and delighted. She immediately called her husband, asking him to come see the prodigy. Milton arrived, listened, and was impressed. He promptly contacted his superior, the renowned journalist Davi Nasser. Davi Nasser, a man of Arab origin, was a prestigious journalist and owner of O Cruzeiro. He held enormous influence throughout Brazil and even internationally. It could be said that he was among the most influential figures in the country at the time. A private performance was arranged at the Nasser residence for the following Friday. This was typical of Davi Nasser. He always verified facts before publicizing them, ensuring credibility. Meanwhile, recalling his time in the army, 1954 to 1955, ADELAR mentioned that he once heard fragments of an Arabic melody that fascinated him. Inspired by a film in which a flute charmer summoned a snake from a basket, he set out to compose something similar. After much effort, he created a piece of extraordinary beauty, though he initially hesitated to claim authorship. At the Nasser home, Honeyed asked ADELAR to play the piece, which he had composed especially with that style in mind. The song, Dança do Pecado, deeply moved Davi Nasser, bringing him to tears. He embraced ADELAR, astonished by the performance. Then the brothers played La Comparsata in their own accordion arrangement, leaving him speechless. Delighted, he invited them back the following week. When they returned, Davi Nasser was waiting with the artistic director of Copacabana Records. After that meeting, the brothers left certain that they would record their first LP.
De Acordeões of Mário Mascarenhas.
In 1954, Mario Mascarenhas was famous for producing books of sheet music for accordions. His works were distributed throughout Brazil and were immediately acquired both by aspiring players of this noble instrument and by other musicians. Mascarenhas was as famous as he was wealthy, but what truly stood out was the academy he ran in Rio de Janeiro for accordionists. This educational establishment, to give an idea of its scale, had 27 teachers and a vast number of students, even putting on theater performances with 300 accordion players. Mascarenhas himself did not perform, he was solely the teacher. At the time, he did not have a repairman or tuner for accordions, and in one room there were about 30 broken instruments, which drove him mad, since such instruments were essential to his academy. It should be noted that the accordions were bought new, but once there, they suffered certain setbacks. Upon arriving in the marvelous city, surrounded on all sides by the Atlantic Ocean, with the sea in many places bordering the buildings, they were quickly informed that the sea air was intensely harsh. As the salt air rusts and thickens metals, this happened to the reeds of the accordions, throwing them completely out of tune and rendering them useless until someone could fix them. At that time, however, in Rio de Janeiro there was no one who knew how to repair them, much less clean the reeds and tune the instrument. One day, Mascarenhas learned that in Rio Grande do Sul, more precisely in Caxias do Sul, there were certainly many people who knew how to repair accordions. So, at Mascarenhas' request and with money in hand, his nephew Abel de Lemos set off to make contact and hire a repairman, with the task of bringing him to Rio. However, upon arriving in Caxias, the repairers he found did not want to move to the marvelous city. 2 months went by, and the nephew became desperate, searching here and there. His uncle's money ran out, and he soon found himself in debt to the boarding house. At that time, telephones were extremely rare, and those who had a line were not interested in giving up a few minutes, so he could contact his uncle. Days passed, and Abel's situation became critical. It seemed he would have to flee the city. May God have mercy on him, for the young man knew nothing of Rio Grande do Sul and had no money left. He would have to beg rides from truck drivers along the roads, and might not get them, as he was unknown and could lose his way. It was in this dilemma that the poor nephew found himself when Huneed and ADELAR Bertussi arrived in Caxias, coming from Malta. The two brothers had already discussed and agreed that, at the first opportunity, they would head to Rio de Janeiro. Their names were already being mentioned in circles, and some already knew of the duo's resounding success. In conversation with friends, almost casually, they mentioned their desire, and someone told them, "You want to go to Rio de Janeiro? There's a man from there here." He then explained what Mascarenhas' nephew had been doing and described his critical financial situation. Huneed had learned a great deal from Mascarenhas' books, and so the brothers went to find Abel. They quickly located him, and after some conversation, Huneed offered to lend him money so he could settle his debts and return to Rio. It should be made clear that this conversation took place in December, and the brothers had already been contracted for many dances, commitments that could not be postponed or canceled. If they waited until April of the following year, they would go to Rio, collect the money they had lent, and repair the accordions they found. In the end, Abel de Lemos left Rio Grande do Sul and explained everything to his uncle. Mario Mascarenhas, having no other way to solve the problem of the broken accordions, confirmed that he would wait for the brothers. In April of the following year, 4 months after the agreement in Caxias do Sul, the Bertussi brothers were there, presenting themselves at the famous music academy of Mario Mascarenhas. As good gauchos, they honored their word. Upon arriving at the academy, they were promptly received by Mascarenhas, who had been anxiously awaiting them and immediately wanted to repay the money lent to his nephew. Here enters Huneed Bertussi's shrewdness. Since they were seeking opportunities in Rio, they refused to accept the money, knowing they would win Mascarenhas' favor and earn his trust. With that settled, they began negotiating the repair of the accordions. Huneed, clever and committed to his purpose, also refused to charge for the service, which Mascarenhas contested. Uneasy with the refusal, he devised a way for the brothers to earn money. "Let's do the following. All right, you won't charge me, but for each accordion you fix, I will recommend you to my students, who also have instruments needing repair. Then you can charge them." With Huneed's full agreement, that is what he did. It is worth noting that Huneed and ADELAR knew how to repair accordions, but were not tuners. However, before going to Rio, Huneed sought to specialize in tuning. There were 2 accordion factories in Rio Grande do Sul, Universal in Caxias do Sul, and Todeschini in Bento Gonçalves. Huneed went to Bento, where he had acquaintances who taught him the art of tuning, indeed, more than he expected to learn. He left the factory an expert. The detuning was actually easy to fix once one understood the cause. In Rio, an expert explained, the climate causes sea air to rust and thicken the reed, which creates hoarseness. Apply sewing machine oil, let it sit, then clean it with cotton. Use a razor blade to gently scrape it and repeat until clean. In the end, almost all returned to normal. Needless to say, Huneed, being a man from Malta, was highly competent and never left a single accordion less than perfect. Within 30 days, all of Mascarenhas' instruments were like new.
ADELAR's desire to study.
ADELAR no longer needed it, but his thirst for knowledge led him to enroll with the Academy's best accordion teacher. He even paid in advance for the lessons. ADELAR had always been studious, practicing 4 hours daily with Waldomiro Torres do Valle, a renowned conductor. Later, he studied the same amount with Professor Leonardo Caff, a European accordion champion. Returning to the academy, in the first lesson, the teacher asked what ADELAR could do. He picked up the accordion and played brilliantly, leaving her astonished. Then the unexpected happened. She canceled his enrollment. Mascarenhas had strict moral rules, no flirting within the academy. When ADELAR learned of the cancellation, he was shocked. Asked if he had behaved improperly, he denied it, insisting he had shown only respect. Mascarenhas called the teacher to explain. She lowered her head and said, "I canceled his enrollment because I cannot teach him. He knows everything, often better than I do. He should be my teacher." Back to Rio, performances and radio. Mascarenhas, delighted, invited ADELAR to perform at a student recital. ADELAR prepared ora staccato and practiced intensely. On the day after the students performed, Mascarenhas introduced him skeptically.
ADELAR played and stunned everyone.
Applause thundered, and Mascarenhas, amazed, exclaimed, "Where did you learn that?" The audience demanded more. ADELAR invited Honey to join him. They played La Comparsata in their own style, perfectly synchronized from memory. The reaction was overwhelming: applause, admiration, even attempts to embrace them. The following Monday, Mascarenhas asked about their goals. After hearing their story, he promised, "I will fill your schedule. I'll get you radio programs and drive you crazy." That was exactly what they wanted.
Refar-se dentro Samaler Stations, Rádio Mauá, Ministério da Educação, and Mairink Veiga.
After a week of success, he said, "Now to the big ones, Radio Tupi and Radio Nacional." These were the largest stations in Brazil at the time. Their success there was immediate, explosive, and it continues to this day. The Dance of Sin, the first record, and the fate of the two brothers. Between one chimarrão and another, ADELAR, removing the straw from his mouth, confided to Valmir Zanelato that he had never expected that the song he had painstakingly composed during his time in the army, inspired by the tunes that made little snakes rise from baskets in Arab scenes, and which had moved the journalist Davi Nasser to tears, would become the very piece that would lead them to record their first album. After the recording, it should be noted that Honey'd returned to the South. He felt an unbearable longing for his family, the kind of deep homesickness that only a gaucho feels when far from his homeland.
The BERTUSSI Brothers, em 1955.
Meanwhile, ADELAR continued performing throughout the region of Rio de Janeiro. During one of his radio appearances, he befriended Eder Lobato, an important music entrepreneur who organized artistic caravans and took shows to nearly every city in Brazil. Thus, ADELAR, now part of the caravan, came to know all of Rio de Janeiro and also performed in Espírito Santo and much of Minas Gerais. The Bertussi arrive in Copacabana. A gaucha, a steakhouse built at the request of Getulio Vargas, was located near the Catete Palace and also close to the home of the great singer from Santa Catarina, Pedro Raimundo, who had achieved tremendous success in Rio Grande do Sul. The Bertussi brothers performed in that steakhouse for 4 months, every day, from 9 p.m. until 1 a.m. It was there that they received an invitation to perform at the most fashionable nightclub in Brazil, the famous La Ronde, located in the prestigious and internationally known neighborhood of Copacabana. There, the brothers performed from 2 a.m. to 7 a.m. The Story of the Penitentiary, with Gregorio Fortunato and Grande Otelo. Mascarenhas was one of the most influential men in Rio and, likely in coordination with the authorities, often sent his students to perform in penitentiaries, perhaps to ease the suffering of those imprisoned. It was 1955, and Brazil was still shaken by the suicide of President Getulio Vargas on August 24, 1954. One day, Mascarenhas invited the brothers to join other students in performing at a prison. There, they met Lieutenant Gregorio Fortunato, who was imprisoned, accused of having killed President Vargas. In conversations with the Bertussi brothers, he confided that he was being held so that he would not reveal the true story behind Vargas's death and was forbidden from speaking to journalists. If he were released, he said, he would change the known version of events. However, Fortunato was never freed, despite rumors that he would be. Sometime later, He was murdered inside the prison. Later, it became widely known among Brazilians that the story was indeed quite different from what had originally been reported at the time of Vargas's death. The man of the bombachas and wide-brimmed hat, known as the father of the poor. In the same prison, there was also an Afro-Brazilian inmate with a mischievous expression, Sebastião Bernardes de Souza Prada, who would later become internationally known for his comedic roles and his partnership with Oscarito, recognized in films as Grande Otelo. As a biographer, I can only imagine the scene. ADELAR never clearly explained how he lent money to Grande Otelo. Perhaps Otelo, clever as a fox, tricked the young and kind-hearted ADELAR. For whatever reason, ADELAR never saw that money again, as he later told me, Valmir Zanelato, that Otelo was, at that time, the most carefree man in Rio de Janeiro, with a wife and daughter of Gregorio Fortunato. One day, Mascarenhas sent the brothers to the home of a woman who lived on a small farm, in what was then the Baixada Fluminense. She was hosting a party and needed accordion players. When the Bertussi brothers learned who she was, they were astonished. She was the wife of Lieutenant Gregorio Fortunato, whom they had met in prison. They went to the property and encountered something unusual. According to ADELAR, she was a tall, very dark-skinned woman, likely of Guarani indigenous descent. Yet she had strands of blonde hair of a shade they had never seen before. The brothers had known many indigenous people, but had never seen one with blonde hair. ADELAR said she was not particularly beautiful, perhaps even considered unattractive. But her daughter was stunning, truly enchanting, a goddess. Even her name was beautiful, Belinia. She was the kind of woman who could stop traffic on the busiest avenue. ADELAR, a lively young gaucho with a taste for beauty, immediately fell in love with her. Whether there was any romance, he modestly never revealed. A letter from Brazola and the contract with TV Tupi. During a trip to Porto Alegre, Honeyed once spoke with Federal Deputy Leonelda Mora Brazola. Brazola, a proud man and fellow gaucho, admired the culture of Rio Grande do Sul and recognized talent. Already aware of the brothers' success, he opened doors for them. He told them that when they arrived in Rio de Janeiro, they should seek him out at the Chamber of Deputies, promising a pleasant surprise. Sometime later, the brothers went to Rio and sought out Brazola. But when they arrived, the place was crowded beyond belief. How could they possibly find him? ADELAR often said that the angel protecting them was strong, and once again, fate intervened. As they were thinking of a solution, someone recognized them and shouted, "Aren't you the Bertussi brothers? What are you doing here?" After hearing their story, the man smiled. He was one of Brazola's aides. He took them aside and said, "Let's wait here. He should be arriving." Moments later, a large car pulled up and Brazola greeted them warmly. He took them to his office and handed them a letter to present to the director of TV Tupi. At that time, radio and television stations all had live audience programs and were always looking for new talent. The brothers went to the station, where a staff member read the letter and asked them to wait. They didn't have to wait long. The director himself came out, embraced them, and said, "So you're the Bertussi brothers? Everything is ready. Starting tomorrow, you are the new hires at TV Tupi." He didn't even ask how much they wanted to earn. It didn't matter. The Bertussi brothers were already worth their weight in gold and were certain to elevate the station's programs. ADELAR on Gildo de Freitas, Jamie Catano Braun, and Vicente Ribeiro, the Golden Boy. When asked, ADELAR spoke readily. According to him, Gildo de Freitas was, and would long remain, the greatest troubadour of the Gaucho Pampas. He had a unique style, always on the defensive, unlike others who boasted loudly. Gildo would calmly dismantle his opponents, leaving them disconcerted and ultimately defeated. ADELAR also spoke of Vicente Ribeiro, known as the Golden Boy, a gaucho from São Borja and, in his view, the greatest improvisational singer he had ever known. Vicente would observe what was before him and deliver astonishing improvised verses, never shying away from any subject. He also expressed deep admiration for Jaime Catano Braun, another gaucho from São Borja, whom he considered the greatest plagiarist in the traditional gaucho poetic sense to have ever lived under the blue sky of Rio Grande do Sul. ADELAR concluded by reflecting that as the old gauchos pass on, each takes with them a piece of the history of traditionalism in Rio Grande do Sul. With changing times and shifting values, this cultural heritage is increasingly forgotten, especially by those disconnected from its roots. And finally, he said it would be very difficult for another figure of Jaime Catano Braun's stature to ever emerge again. ADELAR, the friend and good payer, and the story of the Chimarrão gourd. In Torres, at the ranch where he lives, the businessman Valmir Zanelato owns a photographic studio, Photo Arte. For some time, he has been producing and supplying certain works for his friend ADELAR Bertussi. As for payment, the installments gently accumulate until they form a considerable amount due. On the day of payment, the two are comfortably seated in the large room of the Mulata farm, and while ADELAR tells stories of a life well lived and well played, a check arrives in the hands of his biographer to settle the debts of the past months. In the large room of the farm, comfortably settled, Valmir and ADELAR chat amicably. This friendship has lasted for more than 30 years, and, joking here and there, Valmir provokes ADELAR to tell stories from his wanderings throughout such a successful career. ADELAR does not hesitate and begins with a story he learned much later, told to him by Erdan, a member of the band Garotos de Aro. This story truly demonstrates the prestige and respect dedicated to the living legend in the most distant corners. Erdan told ADELAR that one day the band arrived at the house of a rancher in Mato Grosso do Sul. As usual, after greetings and handshakes, they went to the kitchen to prepare the traditional chimarrão. Upon entering the room, the first thing Erdan saw was a beautiful gourd set aside in a corner. It seemed to have been stored there for a long time, and he was surprised to see that it contained yerba mate already aged, with the bombilla stuck in place as if it had not been touched for ages. Naturally, as a good gaucho, Erdan could not accept that someone would show such neglect toward a gourd meant to be used and to provide pleasure to those who drink the bittersweet chimarrão. He picked up the gourd and was about to say something to the owner, who came running in desperation, clearly realizing that Erdan had come across it. Indignant, Erdan complained, "Who could leave this like this? The gourd and the bombilla are going to waste." The man, out of breath, jumped toward him, forcefully snatching the gourd from his hands. "No one touches this gourd." From this gourd drank the greatest accordionist singer ever to emerge from Rio Grande do Sul, the great ADELAR Bertussi. Epilogue. Here is a complimentary summary of the story, clarifying and adding some details. There is nothing more pleasurable than being able to tell a little piece of a story, especially when it speaks of a great gaucho, an accordionist singer, of his composing, his playing, and his singing. Upon finishing this book, I decided to make some additional remarks that certainly cannot be left out, so that other details of ADELAR Bertussi's life may be better understood. On the very last day of the first half of February 1933, just a few hours before the 16th, ADELAR Bertussi was born in the homeland of the Bertussi farm, which had been built by the farmer and Maestro Fioravant, there in the region of Craiova, in São Jorge de Malata. It was there that one of the most remarkable gauchos and a highly renowned accordionist, singer, and composer was born, who would bring great joy, honor, and glory not only to the people of Rio Grande do Sul, but to all corners of Brazil and much of the world. Son of Fioravant Bertussi and Juvelina Siqueira Bertussi, ADELAR, from the time he was a boy, like his father, the old, strong Fioravant, carried within him a special inclination, a great love. and a strong and burning passion for the divine art of music. As the youngest child of the couple, he had 3 brothers, Wilson, Valmir, and Hunnid, the eldest, with whom he would form the first known gaucho accordion duo, named Hermeos Bertussi. From a very early age, ADELAR began to follow in his father's footsteps. Besides being a prosperous rancher in the Mulatto region, the immigrant Fioravant was also a musician and, around 1918, had become the leader and conductor of a band. Before him, the band had been led by Maestro Cornelius, a compatriot who claimed to be from the region of Novo Hamburgo and who spent about 3 years there teaching the local people his art, also performing at celebrations and festivities throughout the surrounding areas. ADELAR Bertussi, alongside his constant life in ranch work, became familiar from an early age with many of the instruments of the band conducted by his father. It is worth noting that the first songs and musical styles he heard came from the first radio that Fioravant had purchased, the only one in those remote parts, a model from the traditional brand Telefunken. The radio had been ordered and bought from a traveling salesman named Gasto Beniti, who was from the region near Caxias. ADELAR was still very young at the time, but that did not prevent him from being amazed by the novelty. He recalls that the first station tuned by Gasto on that memorable late afternoon was Radio El Mundo of Buenos Aires, followed by Radio Gaucha of Porto Alegre, Radio Tupi of Rio and Sao Paulo, Radio Nacional of Rio de Janeiro, and Radio Record. Through these stations, the brothers grew up listening to great names in Brazilian country music, such as Jararaca and Ratinho, Os Tres Batutas, Alvarenga and Ranchinho, Raul Torres and Florencio, and the accordionist Rielli, whose song, Mula Preta, stood out among many hits. Around that same time, Pedro Raimundo in Porto Alegre, the cheerful gaucho of the radio, was beginning his successful career with songs like Adiós, Mariana, and Sade de Laguna. In 1940, due to the enthusiasm of the youngsters at home, Fioravant formed his own band. Hunnid played the accordion, Wilson the clarinet, later saxophone, and the group was named Dois Perungos Acoirados. ADELAR, at 7 years old, played the tambourine, Fioravant played the clarinet, and Valmir, who preferred dancing, was tasked with carrying the bass drum and drums. At just 10 years old, ADELAR already played the cavaquinho skillfully. At 14, in 1947, he experienced his first major step, helping his brother Hunnid, 10 years older, and playing his first dance with him. At that time, Hunnid was already well known in the region, and they performed at a carnival dance at Club Santa Cruz in Bom Jesus, in the Serra Gaucha. In 1949, with his father's consent, ADELAR began music lessons with Professor Waldomiro Torres do Valle. The following year, an Italian accordion teacher, Leonardo Caffi, arrived in Caxias do Sul, and both ADELAR and Hunnid refined their skills under his instruction, deepening their connection with classical music. On April 24, 1948, the first Center of Gaucho Traditions, CTG 35, was founded in Porto Alegre. This is notable because just a week earlier, at 15 years old, ADELAR had played his first solo dance, as Hunnid was hospitalized and unable to perform. On December 26, 1949, the duo was named Hermeos Bertussi by Alvaro Aquino during a radio program in Lagoa Vermelha. In 1952, traveling by truck rides, ADELAR with Remy Steedile and Hunnid with Ivo Cinelato, they made their first trip to Sao Paulo, going, as they say, with nothing but courage. They stayed at Hotel Iguaçu and, the next day, dressed in traditional gaucho attire, proudly walked through the city, attracting attention everywhere they went, visiting major radio stations in search of opportunities. They also visited record companies and performed on Radio Tupi, Radio Nacional, and Radio Record, appearing on various programs, which yielded them quite a good return, making them much more sought after from then on. The brothers returned to Sao Paulo in 1954, but they decided, advised by their friend Raul Torres, to go back to Rio Grande do Sul, where they would prepare a solid repertoire and attempt a more promising breakthrough in Rio de Janeiro. Around that time, one afternoon while he was in Caxias do Sul, Honeyed ended up meeting a fellow from out of town, a man by the name of Abel de Lemos, who was the nephew of Mario Mascarenhas. The latter, as was well known, had a famous academy for accordionists in Rio de Janeiro, and his nephew's visit to Caxias do Sul was due to his desperation. Mascarenhas was looking for a professional who knew how to repair and tune his accordions in the marvelous city. At 5 o'clock on May 7, 1954, heading to Rio de Janeiro, Honeyed and ADELAR Bertussi set off hitchhiking with some truck drivers from São Marcos. After several days of a grueling journey, they managed to reach Rio and stayed at Hotel Alameda in the Gloria neighborhood. As soon as they settled in, without wasting any time, they went to the Mascarenhas Academy, which at that time had more than 1,200 students and 27 teachers. In the very first days, Honeyed began repairing and tuning the many accordions that were sitting idle in that institution. Mascarenhas, recognizing the value of the gauchos, introduced them, through friends, to perform in the best venues in Rio. Then, as the duo's name rose, they were hired by TV and Radio Tupi and were interviewed by the most famous magazine of the time, O Cruzeiro. From then on, they began forming friendships with important figures, including the journalist Dabi Nasser, Savuka, Lucio Alves, Dominguinhos, Luis Gonzaga, and many others. Sometime later, the King of Baião even paid them a visit at the Bertussi farm, there in Malata. Master Gonzaga left, written in his own hand on one of the shed's walls while they were having a barbecue, the following dedication. On September 23, 64, the King of Baião and King of Brazilian charm, Luis Gonzaga, sang in the shed. To the Bertussis, my gratitude. Luis Gonzaga, old-timer. On July 21, 1955, the brothers signed a contract with Copacabana Records and recorded their first album, Coração Gaucho. In just one day, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., they recorded 9 songs, all bearing their names. The entire career of the Bertussi brothers was crowned with glory. However, on March 26, 1966, by mutual decision, each went his own way after performing in Caxias do Sul during the famous Grape Festival. Even so, their records continued to be played, sought after, and disputed by many. Their songs continued to be played and re-recorded by renowned musicians who consistently achieve great success all over the world. ADELAR Bertussi, unable to suppress within himself the destiny given to him by God, that of being a gaitero, first formed a duo with his cousin Itagiba Matana, the Cobras dos Teclados, and later, always with great success, formed the groups Os Reis do Fandango and Coração Gaucho, carrying forward his journey. In recent years, together with his son Guilherme Bertussi, his musical heir, he formed the group Os Bertussi. Continuing firm in his path, in his ranch work, in his wandering, ADELAR Bertussi is, as far as is known, the only living statue with the strength of a living man. The statue weighs more than 300 kilos, made of bronze and over 3 meters tall. The statue of ADELAR Bertussi stands beside the statue of his beloved and departed brother Honeyed Bertussi, both majestically positioned atop the mountain, more precisely on a hill in front of the Bertussi farm, in São Jorge de Malata. At their feet, in a simple, solemn, and eternal tribute, the following message is engraved: the Gaucho homeland, to the Bertussi brothers. At the Malata farm, ADELAR Bertussi now spends most of his time. When his schedule is free, when he is not performing for the public or working with cattle, the trooper of gaucho music welcomes all his fans, as well as friends and neighbors who visit him, with open arms. His greatest joy is receiving visitors who come to see the farm and the monument of the Bertussi brothers. He spends hours and hours drinking chimarrão and chatting with visitors, while from time, to everyone's delight, he opens the bellows of his old and worn accordion, which by now has been played in more than 5,000 dances in the many places known in this gaucho world. Never one to hold back, ADELAR Bertussi now and then bursts into some of his most famous songs, which are sung by him and by those around him. ADELAR takes great pleasure in welcoming all visitors and does so with the utmost care and attention, regardless of social status, color, race, or belief. Sharing with everyone his joy and way of life, the living legend of the Pampas and the trooper of gaucho music continues to perform all over the world. He continues to sing his most beautiful and celebrated songs, which since the beginning of his career have captivated and continue to inspire everyone from the youngest accordion player to the most renowned. The player, the singer, the legend, and the trooper continues to sing and enchant everyone, from children to youth to the elderly, especially the many grandfathers and grandmothers, even those over 100 years old, spread throughout this gaucho world of God. For more stories and about the life of ADELAR Bertussi, his books and CDs. This is the end of the first book of the history of ADELAR Bertussi, where it was not possible to show the more than 100 photos contained in the work. In the coming days, the second book will be released, where it will also not be possible to show photos, as they are only available in the printed books. But see the contacts below, and please subscribe so you can stay informed about upcoming releases.
Follow Valmir Zanellato. Contacts, Portuguese.
Contact with the author. Search on Spotify, search on Pexels for Valmir Zanellato. There you will find more than 40,000 professional photos, with over 1.4 million views per month.
Search on YouTube on the following 4 channels: Valmir Zanellato Channel, Raízes Gaúcha Channel, É de se Pensar Channel, Canções da Terra Channel.
There you will find more than 50 spoken books clips and his 4 music albums, short stories, poetry, spoken books.
On Facebook, follow Valmir Zanellato.
All music albums by Valmir Zanellato. Search on Pexels for Valmir Zanellato. There you will find more than 40,000 professional photos, with over 1.4 million views per month.
Search on YouTube on the following 4 channels: Valmir Zanellato Channel, Raízes Gaúcha Channel, É de se Pensar Channel, Canções da Terra Channel.
There you will find more than 50 spoken books clips and his 4 music albums, short stories, poetry, spoken books.
On Facebook, follow Valmir Zanellato.